So the next stage in this picture will be to add our talent. And we're going to do two versions of this. So I know on location I mentioned that the picture changed and that I wanted to bring the person forward and make our cowboy a little bit bigger. So we're going to do that version for the brighter, more sunny image. But for this cooler image, we're going to do something that's a little bit closer to the initial intention of the picture, so you could see how that will turn out. And use the select we have here, which feel decent to me, still have some of that stuff that I was drawn to at the end of the shoot. This was one of the last frames before we moved into shade, where we did pull the horse up closer to him. There was some interaction, as you see in here. He still have his glasses on, and I like him definitely better without. So we're going to take one of the frames where we did not have the glasses on. We're going to add this head onto this body. And then there's the light spillage from the lantern, which I really like. So we're going to try to add that right in here. And you see this hand position and the ropes here. It's not too far off what we see in here. So I think that's going to be fairly easy to accomplish. So we're going to do this in a couple of rounds. We're going to start with this head and we're going to drag it in here. And again, you see I just have my selection tool. I hold down the command key, which gives me the move tool, and I drag it over. We're going to do the same for this part right here. And we're going to put it in and we're going to close that out. So we have our head and we have our lantern. And to highlight these, to rename them, it's just a double click. I'm going to do that right here too. And we're going to call this for our cowboy. And that should do it. So I'm going to turn off the lantern for a minute and just work on the head and see how that will work out. So we're going to select the layer, add a layer mask, and this one should be fairly easy to mask out. We start with our magic wand. We come in here and we just want to include the edges. Again, it's about holding down the shift key to add to the selection we already have. And now that all the edges of this is selected, we're just going to fill it with black. We're going to deselect this and then see how close we are with the heads. Just going to come in here and just place it beautifully right on top. Right now I'm just looking at the edges of the hat. It's a tiny bit different perspective here, but I think we still can manage to tweak that in there. So we're going to do like this. Then we're going to come underneath. We're going to add a layer mask to our cowboy. And let's say we want to just cut this right at the neck. I'm going to take this here and just add a layer mask. There he is gone. It's the headless horseman right here. I'm going to add this up. Then we're going to cut this right at the neck as well and see if these two things will line up. Again, it's about selecting and just filling it with black. All right, so there's a little bit of discrepancy here between the two necks, but also maybe the size of the head. So you're going to put this at an opacity, and then I'm going to disable our layer mask underneath, so we pull up the head under, and then we can just see at an opacity sort of the size of the two heads and compare the two. I'm going to put them at the eyebrow. You see the top head we're trying to add is a little bit bigger. Just going to shrink it down a little bit more. That seems really, really close. Put the opacity back up. Enable the layer mask again. And then we're just going to try to add these two together. So that's one way to try to match these up. And just push this back this way. I think that might be the better. The other way would be to use the neck of the other select and connect them right up here, but I think something organic like the sweater here to connect it right in here should be good. Again, it's just a toggle between the eraser and the brush, painting in black or white on our mask. And I think that feels pretty good. So there's also a tiny bit of color discrepancy between the two. This head definitely feels a little warmer than the cowboy underneath. So we're going to come into our curves, and we know that if the head is too red, we're going to come into the red layer, and we're going to retract some red. Give it a little bit of magenta. I'm going to connect those two layers. And then I'm going to just see. It's a slightly different perspective, as I mentioned, but I don't think people will notice when we zoom out. The head feels a tiny bit big. Even though I lined them up because of the perspective, it feels a little big. So I'm going to zoom in again and just try to shrink the head down a tiny bit. Call this blend. I think that feels pretty good. When we look at this file, we see we have a little bit of motion blur to the horse, and it's not extremely sharp into these either. So I think when we start putting this in, that we maybe should add a little bit of sharpness to this. And looking in here, might just be a tiny bit of motion blur actually. Might be the shutter that I've shaken it or something like that. It's not fully sharp, but definitely good enough for this picture in our use. So you're going to select the cowboy and do a little unsharp mask on this. Do that at about 46%. And we're going to do the same with the head. And I think that feels a little bit better. All right. Then there's our lantern. The lantern is going to be a little bit more tricky, but should not be too hard. So we're going to dive into that as well. I'm going to select the hand and the legs here. And we have some good spillage on the ground, but I'm not sure how much of that we will use. So what we're going to do is just invert that selection. And then again, it's Option Delete, fill it with black, which is our foreground color. And we're going to shrink that down, obviously, to fit. Maybe I'll just line it up on the sides first. So I see where the legs and boots line up and the hand line up. Just about there maybe. And I place that right on top. So I'm going to try this again. I'm going to include the hand, maybe some of the rope in there. Maybe some of the rope falling down, but I'm not sure how much of that we'll keep. We're going to invert that selection. And we won't use the leg either, I don't think. Maybe we even cut out the light right there. Maybe we'll paint some of that warm spill on there in a minute. The hand definitely feels too big. And I think we should rotate it too. Just so that the lantern hangs down, so it feels like it follows gravity a bit better. This right here lines up pretty beautifully as well. So we'll see, maybe we'll just cut that long rope that comes around here out. See if we can get that done and start blending things in there. So from here on out, we'll use a couple of the same tools. We use the brushes and we'll use our selection tool, our lasso tool. So from here on out, we'll use the brushes and we'll use our lasso tool to make these selections. So the hand is important to me, so I start with that transition, and then we can see how it all shapes up afterwards. The warm spillage in here I think we should keep, and just as we did with the sheets when we retouched our conversations piece, just try to find some edges that we could follow and mask out along. So right in here, and then the rest can just sort of live as it is. So I'm turning the backward key here, / key, to just get my mask in there and see how that follows. Then we're going to come on the outside, and there is quite a bit of warmth in here too, but you're not going to want to see a second horse in here, so I'm just going to cut these out. So this just ends right here, so there's no reason why we shouldn't just, or couldn't just cut it off a little bit earlier. So I'll just see what that edge looks like, and then maybe I'll use a brush that's similar in the bottom than that. It'll obviously be an erase. I will obviously use a softer brush, so it will be similar to what we see down there at the edge of it, and it give it a little bit of a edge like that. Now that we have gone a softer brush, we can just take this whole area and take it out. Again, it's about filling down in here as well. You see we lose the detail here in the glow from the strobe. So maybe I'll just take this part of the lantern and I copy it and flop it so that we get this edge here clean. And that way it will feel like the light is spilling more from the interior of this rather from the outside like we truly have it. So we're going to take a look at that as well. Again, I'm not so worried about masking this perfect now because I still don't know where and how all these pieces will fall. So you're going to select this layer, our content layer, copy, Command Shift Paste, which is paste in place, Command T, we hold down our Control key, which will pull up the pull down menu when we click. And then we're just going to come down here to flip horizontal. That will give us the edge on this side. I'll rotate it a tiny bit. Just going to line up the top and the bottom here. Just about there. So we obviously don't want to make this look like we've flopped it. So I think I rotated this too far. Again, adding a layer mask. We increase our brush and we're just going to paint in here. I'm going to keep as much of the original as we can without the big bleed that was on the outside. So just going to come in here and just maybe add an opacity, bleed the two into each other. Again, it's not ideal, but it's what we have to work with, and we try to make all the pieces that we have as perfect as possible with the elements that we have available to us. So this is feeling pretty good to me. So we're going to connect these two layers. This way, this mask above here, this layer above this layer will not go beyond the mask that we have for the lantern initially. So by masking this on this lantern layer, we will actually mask both these layers. So it's just to come in here and try to mask things out a little bit better. And I think we might have to do some individual cloning here to get this to look perfect. I'm trying to find one piece that won't overlap in a weird way, but they kind of seem to do. So what we kind of do in here afterwards is to come in and add some glow and yeah, mask this out perfectly, and maybe you have to clone a piece from here and a piece from there to make this sit perfectly. So we're going to run into some small issues here in that we're going to see the poncho from the back plate underneath this. So I'm just going to try to find a way where we can maybe maintain the glow but still see the original poncho underneath. So I'm going to keep this here as a good reference. I'm going to select a few more pieces here. As I go and do this, I feel like my selection here is being feathered too much. We're going to come up here. We're going to set this to 0.5 rather than 1 pixel of feather. That means we get a little crisper line as we walk in and use the lasso selection tool. I'm getting a little quiet here as I focus on my lasso tool points, but still the process is the same. I select my lasso tool, I hold down my option key, and that will allow me to set anchor point as I do this, and I just paint around as best as I can. We're starting to get a lot closer. Going to spend another 2 minutes on this till we have the ropes for the horse cleaned up, selected, and then we're going to drag this into the background plate that we did in the last section. This is my pop-up menu just showing up, and if I set an anchor point and then drag this anchor point outside of the frame, it will move the canvas behind it. So if I want to select something that, let's say, sits over here, it's just to pull my anchor point outside of frame and it will move the canvas for me. So that's what just happened. I'm going to fill that again, and you see on the screen that I fill these areas or these selections twice. And I look at that when I judge how close the selection is. As there is a feather on this, if you fill it one more time, it will spill even deeper into the selection, make the selection a little crisper. So if I don't select it perfect, it will bleed into that whiteness of the area that I'm trying to cut out, or the background area that I'm trying to cut out. And it will kind of help my selection by filling it one extra time. And we're going to do that for sure as we start fine-tuning some of these masks and we start getting into the sky, for instance, around the mountains. So let me see what's going on here. I would love to maybe connect these two here at some point. So I'm going to keep that open. Maybe I'll select it a little bit better. And when I make the main select, the one that's going to sit around the cowboy and the horse and the rope that it belongs to, I could then try to connect these two a little bit better than this and have it be so that the light spill on what I'm masking out now will connect to the ropes underneath from the original frame. The more I can keep of this warm glow, the more authentic this composition will feel. So that's why I'm trying to keep these. You could maybe soften this a little bit, add an opacity, let's say 40%, and a softer brush, and maybe this will bleed into each other like this somehow. But that's for a little bit down the road. Okay, does not feel so bad. So we don't need the top of this. It's just extra pixels to carry with us. We also know that we won't see past this edge for sure. So I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to crop this image. It'll take it down 40 megabytes. So just to shrink down our file a little bit as we move along. We're going to call this for flopped lantern. And then we're going to put all these into a layer group and call this cowboy. And we're going to drag it in here. So let's just see. We're going to put this above the sky. So I just want to make sure that's where we're going to put him when we drag him in here. So a good reference point in some ways is this horizon line and the size of these mountains. So we're going to shrink him down till we see that the mountains somewhat line up. Then we have a true reference of the size of our cowboy. Because we could probably put him in here and it would feel pretty good, but the larger he is, the closer he is to the camera, and the closer something is to a camera, the more so the volume or the lens will be distorted. So anything that's closer to camera will feel more voluminous. It will have a different sort of fall off. You know what it's like when you shoot a close-up of your face. Your nose look bigger, and your eyes, head look bigger when you're closer. And that will be the case here too. So we cannot put this guy really close to the camera. We need to put him roughly where he is. So we're going to try to stick him right in here. It's a little bit of difference here as this ledge comes down a bit and where they stand comes up a bit. So we're going to put him in here and just see if we can sort of blend out that ridge as if this connects up here. That's our intention. So just to get the party started, we're going to shrink him down, use our mountains as reference. And I think that's pretty close. And this obviously can be cheated a little bit, but we want to be in the ballpark when we start. Then the color is a big factor here too. We're way off on the color. I'd say we'll make our mask here on the cowboy layer. Instead of coming down masking on this one, we'll just do it overall because that will include the straps and also the heads and all that stuff. So okay, I changed my mind. We're going to do it down here. If I want to move these heads around later or the lantern, we don't want to remask this. So let's mask them all separately, starting down here with the cowboy, and then we can see how it all fits. It will benefit us later in case we want to move things around. So we're going to start by turning off the head and the lantern and just start masking out this part first. Again, it's fairly simple. We start with our magic wand. I'm just going to do this fairly wide and come around in the areas that's very easy to select. Come in here, we're gonna feather this, half is good, and then come in with our lasso tool, which is already feathered a half, so that should match up fine, and we're gonna select all the edges. What happens if we don't select these edges after feathering it for half a point is that all these edges along here will feather as well, and you will get this little line where the mask was made. So that's why I'm always making sure when I feather something is that to come on the outside of these edges and select that as well so we don't get any funky residue. I selected down in here, but there's a better edge along these rocks here, so I'm going to keep that. Again, it's the same thing. I'm holding on the Shift key so I can add to the selection that I have, making it as good as I can just to start off. All right, that should be good enough. We hit our Command Delete, Option Delete, sorry, and that is our Headless Horseman. The reason for me not taking this too much is that I do want to blend it. So maybe we'll come right in here somewhere. This area of him. Oops, I'm going to undo that and undo it again. Plus key. I'm going to come in there and select that as well. All right, before we go any further, I want to try to get a little bit better color on this so we can get a sense of how they sit together. Come to the cowboy layer, put it on normal. This means that I now can put adjustment layers inside this folder without them affecting what's underneath. Again, we start with our curves. I'm going to just work on the density. Something like that. Just looking at this now, I tell that there will be two densities for me. One on the ground to match this better, and then one for the body. I don't want to make the body too dark, so maybe I'll do this for now. I'll do it a little bit brighter. I'm going to call this for contrast. We're going to come into our colors. Now we see this feels way too yellow and a little bit greenish. So I'm going to come down to the green layer and subtract green. Starting to feel too red. So we're going to come into the red layer and we're going to add more cyan. And as this gets too cyan-y, it feels again too green. And we're going to just push down this. Feels too red. I'm going to start working on the highlights a bit. I'm going to pull them down. Essentially what I'm doing here, when I pull down both the green and the red, is to add blue. So what's really lacking here is blue, but at the same time I don't want to make this too dark. Sorry, at the same time I don't want to make this too bright, so I don't want to come in here and just make it blue like this. It's almost better to pull down the other two to work on the density that we want in this to match the two layers. Now though, we're getting maybe a little bit too dark in the clothing, so we could do the last steps in blending this, coming into the blue channel and pushing that up. The ground now seems pretty close. The top seems a little dark, so we're going to come back to our contrast and we're going to open this up a little bit like this. And then we're going to have a brush, select our quick mask tool, and we're going to select the ground real quick. Not just the ground, but also the legs, so that the legs bleeds into the density and make it more natural. So we get darker and darker along the legs and then into the ground. So now we can invert that selection and we can come in here and we can just blend just the bottom ground. So now I see that this is getting really close, but it feels a little flat. So we're going to come back down to our contrast layer and actually add a little contrast to it. So we push up on this a bit, just in there. And there's two considerations here. I'm looking both at the ground and at the body. So the body feels a little dark. So I'm going to come up on this a little bit. And then we're going to come to this layer, which we're going to name Ground Blend. And I'm going to keep pulling on this, maybe even take down the top anchor point a tiny bit. That's going to offset our contrast a little bit, but I think that's okay as long as we keep adding it at the other layer. Maybe a tiny bit less. So this is all practice. I'm going to, just at the ground level now, add a little bit of cyan to it, as I want to keep a little bit warmth into the body still. I always feel better when the bodies are a little warm, so you're going to stay in this layer. And I think we're there pretty darn close. Maybe we'll add a tiny bit of blue to it. There. So now you see there's almost a seamless ground blend, and this is bleeding into the legs of the horse a little bit. Now the edge here is too obvious, so there's two things here, right? We could bring it more up into the legs like this, which I don't mind actually. We want the focus to go again to the head of the guy, so I'm gonna let this go darker for now, and then we'll see what we'll do afterwards. Maybe we'll come back in and we'll maybe brighten up those legs a bit. So we're gonna come back to our cowboy, and then we're gonna start masking out the area that he stands on so that we could find a good seamless transition here. I like where he's on the ledge, so then it's just to find a way that connects beautifully. Obviously we need to include this grass here because we have the grass sitting right in front of the legs and feet of our cowboy. So either it could sit behind these rocks here so that we mask along this edge we see, so that we get some dimensionality as if it grows behind this. Whenever we do this, so that it doesn't look fake, we even need to add a little shadow edge there, which we can in a minute. So whenever we want to put something in front of or behind another thing, we know that those two elements sitting close to each other will cast a shadow. So we come into our quick mask tool, we select the area where we think the shadow would fall, and we come out of we exit the quick mask tool, we invert that to selection, and then we come in here in our curves again, and we're going to dodge, meaning pull this down. And by creating this deeper shadow here, it feels like this bush is sitting behind this rock. I'm going to come in here so that we clean this up a little bit better. I'm going to call this brush shadow by legs. A little bit of a spelling mistake there. We're going to get rid of that. There. We're going to select this a little bit better. So now that I did this, this was another mistake where I saw that this rock was actually sitting a lot higher. So I'm just going to explore. Maybe we can use this whole thing. Does not look so great. So I'm going to come back to where I was. This actually feels better, even though it's not quite right and it's seeing through here, but the elements feels like they're flowing okay. I'm going to come into my brush shadow. Maybe I want to add more to it, so I just use my erase tool and I erase a little bit in here. I've made it more obvious, so I'm going to take that edge away. And I think that's fine. When we zoom out here, it's going to be hard to see that there's something wrong with that ledge. So we'll start there. Again, obviously if I move this, it won't fit, so we're not going to spend too much time. Again, it's part of the fine tuning at the very end of the picture. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to follow the pant leg. Now I could follow the pant leg doing what I do, or it could be kind of easy to select just the black using the magic wand tool. So we're going to try both so you can see. Come around this way. And then the other option is to come in here and just select along the pant leg. And then come back a couple of steps here. Come inside of it. We hold down our control key, we click, we feather this 1/2 inch, 1/2 point. And then we're going to invert it. We're going to hide it. And then we're going to come to the outside. Just brush some of this away. You know, it selected some in here, but it didn't do such a good job, so I'm gonna come in here and paint this away. I'm gonna deselect it. That selection did its job. And then we're gonna just find a place where this sits well. I like this. Would you see that it's getting a bigger difference here and it's getting brighter? But I just think that's because it has not been included in the layer here that we called ground blend. So you're going to come into the ground blend and include this area here in that ground blend tone. And now we see that this fits in there a lot better. All right, I feel pretty good about this. It's starting to feel like the two of them are really here. Obviously, we've got to fine tune all these edges prior to it being perfect. A little slip there. Again, there are many ways to mask things out. So if you have ways that's faster or more comfortable than this, please go ahead and use your methods. If not, just follow along in what I'm doing and you'll be able to mask things out in the end with something that seems seamless when you get it to either a print or the resolution you want to see it on the screen. So two things is happening here. Here we have the horsehair on the tail. We could cut that out completely, but I kind of like it. And instead of trying to cut this out, again, I'm a big fan of blending. So let's see if we could use some of these edges here and see if we could just bleed this brush into the background and use what's going on. It's a little bit of a density difference here, so we're going to come back up to our ground blend and see if it helps if we bring some of that in here as well. Don't want to bring it so heavy into the legs though, so just going to do some of this. It's a tiny bit of a sharpness difference right in here because the focus falls off and you see it picking up again a little bit in the background. So it's not too bad, so you could try to mask it out. You know, use a softer brush and let the two blend into each other. Not the right layer. We're going to come back to the cowboy layer. Let's see what we can do to make this happen. Oops, it didn't select it. So we're going to undo that brushing. We're going to relink our mask and select the mask layer and then come in here. Now at an opacity, I'm trying to just utilize both these layers, the soft blend at an opacity between the background and the brushes. And I'm going to let the rocks just bleed into them a little bit so that they feel a little bit better. All right. This is pretty good, pretty good. This area between the legs up here, maybe down in here, again along this edge, we're going to try to mask out. And you see along this ridge here, we have a little bit of residue. And I'm going to show you a nice way to get rid of that. It's to hold down the command key, hover over the mask, and that will select our mask. You're going to come up here. Well, we can just do it right in here. I'm going to select my select tool and hold down again the control key. You're going to feather this selection. Let's say by 1 this time. Then we're going to invert it. We're going to hide it. And this will allow us to, 1, feather the mask. And then when I invert it, allow us to paint outside the mask. And you see, because of that feather, our selection now bleeds into the mask a little bit. And it would allow me to just come around here and I just brush on the outside, which then will bleed into the current selection. Brush stroke by brush stroke, and that will help us. I'm going to zoom in a bit here so you can see it better. So we are 300% and I brush once, and as I brush, the transparency or the feather in the selection will then allow me to sort of paint into it. And I paint on top, I paint on top, and as I do this 3-4 times, it bleeds into the body and it makes our selection a lot more seamless. So we're going to come back down here. We're going to deselect what we did. And well, that wasn't such a bad selection. There's a shadow here. So I'm going to give ourselves a little bit more space to work with in the selection and come down here and redo it. So again, I'm looking for a point where I could just, come into here. And the reason I didn't cut it right up here like I initially did is that the focus is a little soft up there. So I'm going to come above these brushes and right in here and see if this works. All right, so we connect our selection. Now that we have it, we're going to just go Option Delete again. And one more time. We're going to deselect it and zoom out. And we have a decent selection here. A little bit of mismatch right there. So we're going to come in and work on that a tiny bit. A little bit of funkiness right in here. Maybe that's better. That feels a lot better. Again, when we have these shapes, it's about using the edges and the shapes to find a place where the eye will believe there being a hard selection. So again, I hit backward slash to see where my mask is, and I can come in here and sort of modify it and get rid of residue like I have right there. Work on the really hard edges, which I don't need. So obviously this edge here is not all that fortunate. So I might want to come up in here, follow this down in here and see if you can just avoid that whole brush. Let me see. So this was not quite the best. I wonder if we need to move our guy a little bit further back from the edge. This will allow this area here to connect to this ledge right here. And I think that will make for a better composite. So we're just going to push him back right there. You see these elements start lining up? Right in there. And we don't have to worry about that bush that was halfway cut off in my exposure. Yeah, these ledges here are starting to line up quite beautifully. So now we've got to come back here and redo some of this, but I think we have a better way to make sure these pieces connect. And connect this right in here, right through this. There's a few straws here. Well, there we brushed them out. But I was about to say those we can clone out when we have all the edges and all the connections set. This initially were to be really a single shot. I thought it would be just, the guy standing there and me taking a beautiful picture as the sun was right. But there was these issues, me wanting to capture both the river and the location that was a little bit further up, and then obviously the whole situation with me not being able to loosen up the talent, to be honest. Well, it was really cold and that's my excuse, and he wasn't comfortable, another excuse, but still it is my job as a photographer to make sure that the talent do photograph well, and I managed to make them to relax and make them feel warm and all that stuff. So that process took some time. So that's why I'm here now, paying the price for it, having to retouch this in. Starting to look pretty good. It's a fairly simple composite. Now this ground looks a little dark actually, so we're going to come back to our ground blend. And we're going to open that up a tiny bit. There. Cool. Okay, we're going to continue this till we have our talent standing in there perfectly. I'm just looking at this hair right here from the horse. I don't think I'm going to bother putting that in there. I think we're just going to follow the hard edge and take those out. Just going to do this. That was the wrong layer because I'm selected ground. You're going to need to select our cowboy mask. I'm just going to get into that a little bit. We're going to select our selection. We're going to do what we did just upon the top of the horse. And we're going to feather this a little bit. We come into our feather menu, 1 pixel. We hide it. We invert it. Got to hide it again. So we always invert first and then hide. And then we can come to our brush and we can start brushing in the exterior mask here and let it bleed into our selection, and it will make it a lot better, taking away the residue on the outside. So you see in some places this is obviously not perfect, so we got to come back in here, but it makes it a lot easier for us to go around the first bout at least and make a fairly good selection. All right. For this top ledge here, we're gonna do a quick little multiply. So I'm gonna deselect what I have. I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna select along the edges here. Like that. We're going to come into this layer with the cowboy, the content layer. We're going to copy. We're going to Command Shift paste that in place. And now we have a new layer that includes all the hair. We're going to call this for hair multiply. You're going to put this out of the box or out of the layer folder underneath it. I'm going to turn this off for a minute and then we're going to multiply this. As we multiply it, this hair just falls beautifully into the background. It's a little discrepancy here, so we're going to fix that with our curves and blending this in there just as we have blended all the other elements. So we connect this layer, we're going to call it for blend. And we're going to push this up. It feels a little yellowish, so we're going to come down to our blue layer, pump that up, RGB, bring that up. I don't want to bring it too much because then the hair starts falling away. So maybe this is enough for now and we're close enough. Hair multiply, we add our layer mask, and then we're going to do a bigger brush so that we get an easy transition. Now I'm actually cloning there, which doesn't work. We're going to select our brush and then we're going to just come in here a little bit and softly brush around it. And do it at an opacity so we can get close. Just about there. Then we can turn our cowboy again. We're going to hover over this element and we're going to select that element. Again, it's just Command and click. And then we're going to come up here to our layer and we're going to move this selection up 2 steps so that we have a tiny bit of a pixel overlap there. So we're going to just go 1 up and then so I'm going to do that again. You see I moved the selection by just using the arrow keys, pushing it up 1 pixel or 1 step. Come in here and we're going to delete this or mask it out by doing Option Delete. And there. Now we see that we have the hair blended in there beautifully. We just got to bleed off this little edge that we see in here. So we're going to come in here. We use our eraser and then softly brush these areas in. Then we're going to do the opposite and take away the areas where we have the white background from the original plate. I often do this with all kinds of hair when I layer things into a background. It feels a lot more organic trying to use the blending mode rather than cutting or creating hair. We are going to revisit our conversation series in a finish up of that. For those of you who want to follow, and we're going to put that hair masking into practice and get that hair laying on that pillow quite beautifully. So now I'm looking at this at 400%, and I got to remind myself that eventually, for anyone that will look at this on a screen or pretty big in print, even if this was on a bus shelter, people would have a hard time looking right into these details. It's really just on the screen. It's healthy to make really beautiful selections, but I think this is plenty good enough for the use that we're going to have for this picture. We're going to come back to our lasso tool, and we're going to just select along the ridge here. I'm not going to go too far into this because we are going to blend it with the lantern plate here in a minute. So I don't really know where that falls quite yet, so I'm going to do this real quick. So I think we're getting pretty close. We're going to introduce the head, which I forgot to move. Easy enough. We are not fully set on this head, and it's not done anyway. So I'm going to just dance it over, and plonk it on there. So let's see if we can find our I think it was right in here somewhere. Same process in here. Come down and mask out the stuff around the head. I like to see behind there, so that was kind of nice. Gonna utilize that. Maybe we'll come in with a brush and do like this. Change to the cowboy layer, seeing that this stuff is starting to bleed outside. Back to the head. I'm going to zoom into the head. That's a little bit too much. I'm going to zoom in quite a bit here. So I think we could use the technique by blurring this selection or feathering this selection a bit. So when I do say blurring the selection, we could actually just blur the selection as well. If I go in here and blur my mask, that would be the same as really feathering that selection. It's different uses, but when I talk to you, that's kind of where I come from when I say blur the selection. It's just a different way of feathering or blurring what you have. Selected and non-selected. So I came into the hat there a little bit too much, so I'm going to undo that, come to my eraser and sharpen that up. For this last bit, we're just going to select our selection. I'm going to come inside of it, hold down our control key. So this is what happens when I'm in a brush or an eraser and hold down, I get a different drop down menu. This is not what we want, obviously. We want to come into any of the selection tools, get the feather drop down menu, feather with 1 pixel, Command Shift I for invert. I like to hide it so I can see what I'm doing, but it's still there. And then we just paint around. And if you do 1 stroke, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you see that it starts disappearing, this white line that we have around our selection. So I'm going to go hit Command Hide again so that you can just see how in this selection it's sitting on the outside of the white, but as I start painting, it bleeds into the interior of the selection and the white part falls away. So I think we have a pretty good selection here of our guy. A couple of small little things. I'm going to hit Command D to take away the selection, and then come in here, take away that white spot. And then you're going to come to the eraser and just come in here to the neck a little bit. So I think we're getting pretty darn close. He feels a little saturated to me, and we have not used the use saturation in this layer folder called Cowboy yet. So we're going to come in here and we're going to name this layer for color. And then I think we're going to come underneath, above the contrast, underneath the, maybe above the ground blend as well. And we're going to come into our use saturation. I'm just going to tone this down a tiny bit. Whenever you have this light quality that's in open shade, you will never have a vibrancy of color. It will feel muted like what we see in here. So it's always a good thing to know that in shadow we'll have, if you do composites, it's usually a more muted palette unless you pump it up. So it's good to keep the use saturation in mind and play with that a little bit. And then I can look at that use saturation, and if I want to bring out the poncho, for instance, and give that more red, I could mask it out, but turning it on and off, I feel this use saturation is very quite appropriate. Then there's the lantern. This missed our little move as well, so we're going to push that over. I'm going to turn on the flopped side. I'm going to come in here and try to place this again. So essentially what I'm doing here is to take these edges along here. First of all is to make the strap smaller and then curve a little bit to line up with this warmer light spill strap. I see now that my feather was a little bit too much, but we can come in here and sharpen that just by giving it a little crisper edge using the eraser tool. The smaller the brush, the crisper the edge will be when you use the eraser. So if you want to match the sharpness of this, for instance, you just come in with a really small brush. So as I paint now, just try to use my aesthetic in some way and make and shape a leash here that will tie in together. I'm going to come into the lantern and then keep on shaping this right here at the blend corner here, right there. I'm going to take away that bump right there. I think this is getting more believable. That went too far. I'm going to undo that a little bit. All right, so there's a lot of straps here, and I think I'm just going to take some of these away. We select our cowboy. I'll stop there because I was just thinking, I think I actually got to stop or start way up here and just take away a lot of this clutter here. Let me see. This part here, obviously we have to retouch the overlap, but I think the rest of these can literally just go away. Maybe right in here. Yeah. Come back to our lantern. Now we can start fine-tuning these edges here a little bit. So maybe I'm getting into this a little too soon, but This picture is a little simpler than some of the others we've done. So I think by this time you've done masking out the cowboy, the picture is kind of done. We're going to fine tune the mask in the sky. We're going to do some overall adjustments, obviously, to make it feel a little bit more like nighttime. And then we're going to look at the moon. But I think we're not too far away here to make this work. In this area here, behind the lantern, we see a horse. Now, in this select, obviously, we should see a little bit of the pants and stuff. So I'm just going to come into this area here. And what we're going to do is select it first. And then we're just going to fill a little bit of opacity in here. So let me see. I'm going to put the lantern here into another layer folder, and I'm going to give this layer mask. Let me see. I would need to invert this and then give it a layer mask. Now you see that this area here disappeared, and we have this on a separate layer mask. So I can disable this and will only affect this area. This will allow me to just come in with a brush at 50%. Oops, that took the whole thing. Coming with a brush at 50% and allow this to sort of bleed through a little bit. I'm going to do eraser and then up the size of it, put this at 50%, and then you see we can bleed it back in a bit, and that will allow us to keep some of that glow around it, which I like. So we're going to keep on doing this on this layer group so that we can keep the actual selection, you know, here on this lantern layer, and this mask will only affect this area that we want an opacity on. So using two different masks here, we have way better control in working with just this area and the opacity that we want to try to create, rather than trying to create the opacity on the same selection layer or mask layer as the actual lantern. So we come in here. I think that's pretty good. We're going to feather this. One. I'm going to hide it. You're going to come in here. I'm just going to at 50 maybe just bleed some of this out. So what I have here underneath that I couldn't quite figure out when I saw through the lantern, it's actually a pour mask right in here. So we're going to come back down to the cowboy, and we need to make a better job at this. I don't think we see this edge. Let me see. Yeah, we don't see the edge of there, the rope there, so that we can keep, but we do want to come in here and put this at an opacity so we get a little bit of blue in between the jacket here. So again, it's just using my best judgment, using these brushes to create something that feels organic. Now keep in mind that this is going to be tiny, tiny, tiny. So when we look at this, let me see here at 100%, this mask look pretty darn nice. So even if it looks a little tiny bit off when we're this close, I wouldn't worry about it. A few quick things here. This I've seen a couple of times. It does not show quite through the lantern, but I'm going to do it really quick. I'm going to make sure that we set this on current layer only. We're on the cowboy layer. And most of the time I like to do all this stuff on a separate layer, but this is a simple tag that we needed to get off anyway. There's a little bit of masking issues here. We're going to look at those right away. And what you see here is my true process. As I zoom in and out of the file, I happen to see things, and I like to sort of move around and work my way through the picture. I don't really stick to one tool and do that one thing. It's a picture that sort of grows through the whole retouching process. So it's not one way to do this. It's always a process where you just sit and play with it. All right, I think our guy is in there. Earlier on, I talked about this color fill layer. We used it a couple of times already. And we're going to do that again. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to do solid color, and do some blue tones to it. Put that on color, take this down, and this will be sort of the layer that massages these two pieces together a little bit better. So let's see. With and without, you see we lose some of that warmth in the highlight, but it just blends things together. The greens in here get some warmth, the greens in here get some blues and cooler tones. So does this and so does these, but at different levels. It affects the reds here and the greens here, and it just sort of morphs things together as a composite quite well. I'm still a little distracted by all these lighter rocks down in here. I know he took away some, but it might take away a few more as we go along. Okay, so now that things start feeling good, we're going to start looking at centralized things in this photograph. There are, cleaning some of this up, making it maybe darker overall. We don't see too much of the river down here, so I want to create some highlights, especially in this area, so that our eye go to it. Not sure about these. These could be a destination for him to look towards, another place to go to that gives us a sense of scale, actually, a sense of distance to the mountains. So I could choose to keep those, or I could choose to take them away and make it all clean and natural without any habitants or form of human in here, or shape of human habitat. So I might work on that as well. And then there's the sky. We want to bring the moon in, tone it down, make it a little darker. So I'm going to just do an overall darkness here. The cowboy feels a little dark, and there's two things we could do to that. We could either lighten up our cowboy, or start looking at maybe darken the whole background. And I do think we need to go darker overall to make this feel more like night. So I'm going to come in this layer right here. I have not named this, but we're going to name it contrast. I'm going to pull this down. I think this matches our cowboy a little bit better. And then we're going to actually come to the cowboy and maybe make him a little bit lighter. So you're going to come, I use my plus signs so that I move my anchor points. And instead of trying to use my pen tool on these, I could just slowly push these up a little bit using the arrow keys. There, now bringing this up, the ground blend needs to come down. So again, the plus tool to move my anchor points, and I just pull down the ground blend. Give the ground blend a little bit of contrast there too. There. All right, I think we have successfully put our guy in there. We put a new head on him, and I'm going to turn on that lantern. And the lantern feels pretty good in there as well. What we are missing now in the lantern is a little bit of glow, a little bit of spill onto the pants and the ground, which we knew we had in the original. So it's a little bit of cleanup here too that I missed, and here as well. So let's just take care of that real quick. And name this group lantern so we know that we have it later on. We're going to go into our, let me see, lantern layer, and we're going to select this a little bit down here. And again, the selection process is to add black in the areas that I select so that it goes away. A little bit too much of it right in here, so we're going to come to our eraser and just bring this edge back in where you see my mask is not quite correct. Some places we do have some white edges, and we just we do want some highlights on these edges for sure, but we don't want them to feel too obvious. When they sit against a dark background at night, they wouldn't have that much light spill. So now it's just about to work on this in here, on this lantern layer, but remember we set this layer here to work on only the mask that has the opacity. So I'm gonna come in here and just work on this opacity a tiny bit so we see a little bit more through. Like that. Feels pretty good. Maybe we want to crispen up this edge here a little bit. All right, gonna come back to, you see, I'm gonna turn this off, going back to the lantern layer. I'm just gonna work on the outside here a tiny bit. Nice. As I turn on and off, I just look at the blends and I realize that this edge right here didn't need to have this really dark spot. So I'm gonna just with a soft brush come in here and just try to make these two sides a little bit different, like that. Then we're gonna come underneath this layer. I'm gonna select our layer mask again and make a bigger brush. And then a smaller one, and a smaller one. And what I'm doing by going wide, I had it at an opacity, so we got a wider brush, and then as we get to the center of that wider brush, we add more density to it. We select more of that area, which means that we get a center and then it spills out. You can modify this obviously, and this is just by feel and experience that I do this. So you can come in and work on that feather afterwards to get sort of a warm spill. So again, we exit our layer mask or quick mask. We Command-Shift-I, then we come underneath the lantern, but above the cowboy. And we can start with a solid color maybe and see what that does. This could be done with curves, it can be done with a lot of different things, but I'm gonna try maybe bright yellow. Didn't quite work as well. You see, even it fits behind the darkness of the leg, but it didn't really spill onto the leg much. So I think maybe we should just come back a little bit to our exit quick mask. The selection is still there, but it's hidden. And we just come in here and we try again, this time with curves. And let's see if we brighten this up. Oh, that did not work well. Let me see. I'm going to command hide this. So let me see. I guess I lost that selection completely. So, oh, it's still there. Yeah, no, it seems like I lost that selection completely. So let's try this again. So we come into our quick select and we're going to start with a bigger brush. And then there's several ways to, so we're going to create a glow underneath here. And we're going to come into our quick mask tool and we're going to do a larger brush at an opacity. Let's say 50%. And we're going to hit that once. Twice maybe. Then we're going to come in and give that 100%. We're going to make our brush smaller and make it a little more intense in the center. So that way this light sort of bleeds out a little bit. You're going to exit our quick mask tool, we're going to go Command-Shift-I, and then we're going to go and create a curve that creates this light spill. So first we're going to just make this brightness where the light would fall, and then we're going to give it color. So we start with yellow, and then we add some red. There. So let's see what we have done here. We can turn this on and off and see that we have created a spill that sits in these areas. And I think that's nice enough. If you feel that it went a little too far on this shadow side and onto the horse, we just got to come in here with a soft brush and tone some of that down. What this mask did, it highlighted a few selections that's not quite right, and this area right in between the legs here. So we're going to come back into our, let me see, where's our cowboy layer? There. And we need to select this area for sure. And then this area here is not well. I think that did pretty well, to be honest. I think that did pretty well. There was some issues here with our masking, but it's not terrible. You see, I followed the shape here, and that's if this falls underneath. So let's see what we can get done. I'm not sure if it's all that much to do to it. Let's see, there's a few things here that we can try to do. Come into the lantern layer. See if we can follow that edge here so it's a little harder, so that it looks like the other stuff falls underneath it, just along here. There, and I think that's pretty good. Let me see. I'm gonna make this edge a little textured. All these edges from the carpet is a little textured, so it shouldn't be so crisp. And it's just me tapping on my drawing board on my Wacom tablet to make it a little bit more less perfect, basically. So there we are. We created a little spill to that. And now I feel like we have a good focus point right here. The horse's head feels a little dark, and I think we want to add a little bit of brightness to his face as well, our good cowboy. So now that we have blended the pieces pretty well, I don't want to come in and just brighten this layer. That will just mess up this whole blend. So I think what I want to do is just come in with my brush, again, into our quick mask tool, and just paint a little highlight on his face like this. We invert that selection, come to our head, and we're going to do another mask right here. I'm going to brighten that up, and then we're going to put some warmth into it. Now, if you want to add yellow to this, you can just pull down on the yellow a tiny bit, as if it was some warmth. But instead of doing that, we want to keep the brightness in it. So I think we're going to go to the green, add a tiny bit of green, and then come up to red and add a tiny bit of red. And this is really the same as adding blue when you pull these equally, but it brightens it up rather than darken it down. So I think that was kind of healthy. Let's see. Yeah, it's subtle, but it pulls your attention to the face a little bit more. So it might become too painterly, so maybe we'll do this at an opacity, about 70% maybe, and that will allow me to go back and forth later instead of trying to fuss with the color. So I'm going to call this for face highlight. So here's our guy on the edge of the world, checking it out. Starting to feel pretty good. So we're going to come into the sky and we're going to work the sky a little bit. All right, so we are back and we're ready to start finessing this picture, fine-tuning a little bit the color palette, and then also putting in our moon, which I think will add great atmosphere to this piece. So I'm going to pick up where we lost and just organize the file a tiny bit. I'm going to call this for our background, or back plate, since that's what I've been calling it a lot of the time. So what we see here is that we have our back plate, we have the river piece. Above that we have some contrast that made both of these layers a little bit darker and a little bit more contrasty. Above this we have our sky. We have our sky option, which doesn't feel so bad. Almost highlights his head a little bit better, I feel. So we'll look at that at the end. Maybe we'll all agree that this layer here feels better. So we're going to turn that off for now. Here we have our hair multiply layer, which is just on the neck of the horse. So, and here we have our cowboy layer, and we could put all this together, but for now we'll leave it like this. And then we have a little blue tone on the top. You can turn this on and off and just see that the layers blend together better, but I kind of like the green tones down in here, to be honest. So the result of that observation will be that I'll take this down to about half, from 7% to 4%. Still keeping some of that intangible blend that we get from those layers, but toning it back a bit so we get a little bit more green down in here. Okay, so we're going to look at the sky. And the first thing we're going to do is to put this on normal, because everything we then do within the folder will only affect our sky layer. So obviously the sky needs a lot of atmosphere. It feels a little bit too dull the way it is now. And obviously we want to create some gradients so that we get some darker top and a little bit more drama to it. I also want to create a sense of direction so that it's not so uniform. We see there's a highlight here, and I want to enhance that so that we get some density to the top and left, and we get some brightness here where we already have a little brightness, but also a sense of direction to where he looks so that there's a brightness in the way he's looking and he's leaving sort of the darker side of the picture behind. So let's start there. One thing, there's several ways obviously to get this done. The obvious after watching my process would be to do masks. Now, skies get a little funny sometimes. If we tweak them too much, they get a lot of what we call banding. It means that the pixels get all tweaked in the small subtle gradients within the sky. So let me just see if I could create some gradients for you so you can maybe see what that means. Okay, so here's some obvious ones where you get all this crazy pixelation and bandings, and you get some lines up in here, which is part of Photoshop's inability to deal with really subtle gradients when it comes to skies, for instance. So I'm going to turn that off. Obviously it's not a layer that we would like, but I'm going to try to work with it for a tiny bit. I'm going to give it a more contrast. Maybe we'll start out like this. To help in the process of not creating banding, we're going to try to keep these layers as simple as possible. I have a contrast layer here, and now I'm putting another one on top. So we're going to come out of this one, and we're going to come to our contrast that we already have and just revisit that and push that a little bit harder. There. Now you see the color in this gets intenser the more I tweak this curve. So in this case for the sky, to avoid this pixelation and bending, you're going to take this contrast copy layer and take it off normal and put it on luminosity. You see it almost changed color completely. Now this layer here is only changing contrast and not affecting the color. Now we can actually pull back a little bit on this hue saturation layer, and the less layers we have in the skies modifying it, the better we will be off. We also want to take a look at the sky here and see if we can see more of it. So we're going to unlink the mask and the sky and see if we can just push it up. How about there? It feels a lot better already. And all this stuff is sitting a little bit right above him. I wonder if I should try to push this guy this way a bit. So you get a little bit, still it's above him, but you get a little bit more direction coming out that way. So I think this is a good thing. Now, this file is really big. We started right with processing our files at 110%, which gives about a 70 megabyte file. Now we took that file and added another one to it, left and right back panel. Then we added a sky on top, and building this out, we have the camera, you know, that works around 20 megapixels, that now allows us to have 157.5 megabyte flat file. It's 813 megabyte when we include the layers. So I'm mentioning this because I don't necessarily want to stretch this sky out too much. What I could do is reduce the pixels of the overall backplate, so I don't just increase and increase and increase, but also pay attention to maybe, instead of expanding the sky, reducing the backplate. But I'm kind of in it now, so we're just going to continue this. In the break, I did found a moon, so I'm just going to put this in there right away. And here's our moon layer, and we're going to pull that in here. Put this above this, and let me see. I have a couple of adjustments here within the moon layer, and I think we just need to, let me see, either we abandon it completely or we just embrace it. I think, let me see. I'm just going to turn this off for now. Let me see. I created this glow around the moon to give it like a halo. Often when you look at it, it sort of shimmers around it. So as I pull this in a smaller square, this layer here, let me deselect what I did. I'll show it to you. Here's the moon glow that you see right there. And here's my mask. Now, outside of this, when I pulled it in, will also be affected. So what we need to do here to get rid of that brightness, create that square, Command-Shift-I, and fill this with black. And now my moon glow is only right in there. So let me just show you this. You probably want to know how I did it, but it's as simple as every single process I've done. It's just coming in here with the curves, doing like this and masking it out to follow the halo of the moon. And we have a little brightness around it doing that little trick. So here's our moon that we made a little brighter. I'm going to call this for contrast. And we have the moon glow. I added a little bit of stars in there as well. So this is our moon situation. And then it's just to find a spot for it maybe. How about right in there? It's not so bad. We're going to come back to our moon glow layer, select this area, fill it with black, and that will go away. So let me see. I'm going to keep pushing this a little darker and see what happens. This is better. Now, even if I push this down at the top, I might not want it at the bottom. It feels almost too warm and too red and too dark right in there. So what we're going to do is come up here to the sky on top, and this will be the same effect as I did with the lantern. This mask down here affects the actual sky, and this here will now just affect a little bit of opacity. I'm going to just brush some of this red away and let some of the blue that sits underneath here in the original sky, well, let's just turn that off, shine through a tiny bit. So essentially we're creating a tiny bit of blue there and taking off some of that warmth, and I think that's better. Here's our hue saturation. I think we can use this hue saturation, but not as high. I'm going to come to just about there. Okay, getting better and better. So let's start talking about that shape that I wanted to create, and maybe not using contrast. We already tweaked this quite a bit. So we're going to create a new layer right here, and we're going to fill it with black. Obviously a little bit intense. So we're going to create a mask right here, and we're going to fill that with black too. And then just to start us off, we're going to just come in here and select an area that we would like for this black layer to affect. Let's see. I'm going to come back. I'm going to start over. Way lower opacity. We're going to take it to 10% and use a bigger brush so that the flow of what I'm doing becomes a little bit more seamless. There. And just if you look at this for a second, I'm creating some shape to the sky, essentially a vignette that works very heavy on the top right part of the picture. I'm going to come back here a little bit. Again, now doing the opposite, toning that down. Like that. Maybe I'll bring in some of it here on the other side. I think I'm going to go even deeper. Come down to 5%. What I want to do to this mask here to avoid banding is to give it some grain. So we come up here, filter, noise. I'm going to add some noise, and then maybe 2 or 3%. A mask like this, we're not adding it to the black layer, but only to the mask, so that the gradient get a little bit of noise to it, and that will give the chances for banding and those gradients, you know, a little bit of texture and less of a chance for us to get funky stuff going on in our gradients in the sky. All right, I think we're starting to get better. There's a pinkness to this overall, and I think we're going to come up and do a little adjustment to that. We're going to come underneath the colorful layer, but above the cowboy, so that we can affect the whole picture. And let's see what happens if we add a tiny bit of green to it. I think that feels pretty darn good. I'm going to come in here and call this color. Now in looking at this, I feel the cowboy is looking a little bit too big. I don't know why. When we executed this, remember we looked at the mountain ranges and we took the bottom here and it matched up pretty well with the top. So this should technically be a decent reference of the size of the guy if he stood there for real. But I still want to take him down. So we select our cowboy layer, we include these. Let me just check inside to make sure that every single layer is connected, so we don't move layers and not moving the masks. So I'm gonna just try. I know that this is gonna mess up my masks on the background and we have to redo those, but I think that will be fine. Definitely feels better. A good reference for me is this grass right here. So the grass size here and the grass size there feels fairly similar, so it should be close when it comes to the size of him still. You could use these as reference as well, and the fall off in distance, and it still relates pretty good, I feel. I think I should make this even darker, to be honest. And the cowboy still feels pretty dense in its blacks, and there's no blacks around. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to add some detail into the blacks here, and then we're going to add some darkness to the other stuff. So that means coming into this contrast layer above the river and backplate and pushing that down a bit. It's really coming more into night for sure. So I'm going to come right in there and then come to our cowboy layer into the contrast here. And I'm just going to push up this anchor point a tiny bit, and maybe even here. Now we see that there's a flatness and a shadow density in here that matches a little bit better. Let me make this smaller so you can see. And I'm going to come back and forth again. So I think now this feels a little bit better when the contrast in here and the stuff around matches up a little bit better. What does not match now is the ground blend. So we're going to come into our ground blend layer and just pull that down till we feel that the two pieces match up pretty good. Now we see it matches well here, but not so well in front. So we're going to come in, same process, select our quick mask. Just do this layer here in front. Command-Shift-I. And I'm going to go curve and pull that front piece down a bit. There. Now, keep in mind the spillage of this. So maybe we shouldn't pull it down as much, but add a little warmth to it. So we come into the red layer, a little bit of warmth, and the blue, and more warmth. Now, it works, but not as well. So let's see, let's pull down the color a little bit. So we do less red, do less yellow, and we come to the RGB and we put a little bit more density into the RGB. I'm going to increase the selection of this down in here. Better. Ground blend 2. Quite nice. All right, we're going to keep on working the sky. Doesn't still feel like it has the punch and the contrast that I would like to see from a sky at night, especially now that we made this background darker. His face too feels a little warm, and remember we warmed that up. Might just turn that off for now. Oh, that's our beautiful glow. We're going to call that glow. And the face highlight, I'm just going to turn that off for now. Or maybe I just pull it all the way down to 30%. There. Back down into our sky. And there's a color difference here between the moon and the sky itself. So I'm going to come into the moon, and I think we need to give that some color, at least desaturated or something, because we don't want it to be quite as yellow. And then you're going to come above it. That feels better. Now it seems like it's more in it. And you also want it to stand forward more, and I think that comes as soon as we make the sky a little bit darker. So let me see. I'm hesitating a little bit to go here on this darkness, but I think we should just get it done. Yeah. Also feel like we need some more. Let me see. I'm going to try to do some greens in here. There maybe. So when I turn this mask, the contrast on and off, I like what's going on in the area right above the mountain here. So what we're going to do is come into the mask on the contrast layer right here. We're going to brush in. We're going to do the same as we did for the main layer on the sky mask right up here on the folder. I'm going to do that here as well on the contrast. See if you can just bleed this out a bit so that it gets brighter. All right, so it's starting to feel a lot better. It's not 100% there, but it feels better. I'm gonna just come in here to this color layer I just created. Maybe we add a little bit of blue to it. Now it's starting to feel connected with this blue that we see up here and the blue that we see in the shadows of the mountain. So the blues here, the blues there feel a lot better now that I made these color adjustments. So pretty happy with that. What we're going to do now that we get closer and I start to feel the pieces are in alignment, we're going to move this river piece. This little bend that we had in the river, this highlight, I like this quite a bit. So we're going to move this right in here. Let's see if we can add that to the picture. There's quite a bit of fine tuning that we're going to do here in a while. But for now, I just want to see if we could add this in here. So what I'm looking at is this rock outcropping here. So I got to find something to replace that. So we got to lay this river bend so it disappears into some of these trees down in here. That would be the only solution. So we add a layer mask, we come into our lasso tool, and we're just going to do this real quick. And maybe I'll select right along that edge there. Okay. And then we're going to mask out the stuff around. Not well done. Let me see, I got to invert on my selection. There, and now I can mask around it. I'm going to give that a 0. And now we see that everything around disappears. So there's our little river highlight. So the only thing I really need in this is that river. So I think I'm going to mask everything else away. I don't think there's a reason to keep any of this. So all right. So now we see that we have some residue around this edge here. So as we're looking in here, we might as well clean this up. So this is the river coming into this place. So I'm going to turn the river off for a minute and see if we could pick up this edge here, just using the magic wand. And it did a pretty good job. So we're going to come in here, I'm going to feather it by 1, and then fine tune it. So we only really need this edge here, so we're going to turn the river back on. There's 2 steps to this. We want to make sure that this piece don't blend into this and vice versa. So we're going to start by erasing on the inside of this so that we get something that lines up all the way close to the rocks. And then we're going to invert it and hide it, and then we're going to brush away so we make sure that we get a crisp edge on the rocks like this. Now that we see that the masking I did wasn't perfect, so we're going to come in and fine tune that a tiny bit. So I can feather this edge like I done before, which would probably be the better choice, but I do have some little dots and stuff that sits around, so I'm going to do this real quick. Just make sure to capture this. Okay, I'm going to Command D, and now you saw that I went too far on this, so let's see. Make sure to take that away. I'm going to delete this and just slowly feather into here. So you can see that we have some small little edge issues here. Oh, wrong button. And we're going to fine tune this a little bit as well. There's also a tiny bit of focus issue. I don't think it's a really big deal, but we should probably just sharpen just this part here, the back part of the river piece. The option would be to take and mask that away so that we only see this part up here, which feels a little sharper, and only use the river further down in here where the river is sharp enough. So maybe we'll look at both options here. I'm just gonna, on the folder, create another mask that will only work on this part. It'll take away that river edge though, which I really liked. That does not look bad either. So maybe this is where we set our edges. Obviously that was a really big broad brush, so we got to come back in here and examine this. At least now we took away all our focusing issues. So we come in and hit the backslash button, make sure that we see our masks, and then come in and recorrect some of the stuff. So these pictures here are lining up really quite well. So it's not that, it's definitely not hard to make this look good. I still love this river bend, I have to say. So we're going to come in here and select this edge selection. Let me see if I could just pull this in real quick here. So the other option to what I just did, which is taking it away altogether, would be to try to sharpen it up. So let's see what that does before I make my decision. It seems awfully blurry though. So we come into select our river, and then we're going to do it selectively, and we're going to do our sharpen tool. And I'm going to do it right on top for now, just to maybe see if it has any validity at all. So I'm pulling out here to see what's going on here, and I'm looking at this right here. And what I realize is that this is not as much of a focus issue on my end, because these parts here are really sharp. On this side though, it's not sharp at all, and I believe that's partly the depth of field, but also partly the fall off on the lens, because this is towards the very edge of the lens. Remember, the edge went, let me see, I'm going to change tools. The edge of the frame went right here. So this area right here is sitting in the fall off of the lens, and it's just not good enough at the corners. That's what that is. So I could choose to come in here maybe. It looks awfully sharpened though. So you're going to come back a bit. You're going to come back a bit. Just going to go back in my history palette and softly sort of come through all these layers. You see me just clicking through the different erase areas I did, and this was the last one. I'm going to come in here and I guess just mask this away. I'm kind of looking for a new edge to find. It was not quite an edge here, but there's a tree standing right here. I didn't like it, so I'm going to just use that edge and come up to here. And this will be where these areas are blending. It's a little softer in here too, but it's not too bad. Not too bad. It's a really hard edge here that we're going to try to get rid of. Hard edges just stands out more in photographs when you do masking, so I always try to take away the hard edges. And with that comes a blend in the back focus here that's pretty easy to get rid of. Here's a motorhome. I often get impressed by these cameras that could pick up a tiny motorhome that the eye would not see if it was here. So I'm going to undo this, and this is where the motorhome is. And just do it right on the background layer. We talked about keeping this. I don't think there's a reason to keep this highlight here. Now that I'm at it, I'm just going to get rid of some of these things here in the background. And again, I'm holding down the Option key, and I set my clone point, and I set it in something that's similar in texture and color to what I want to clone around or erase, or opposite of what I want to erase rather. And I'll just paint along. So I put my point at the edge, and then I go along the edge. And with that, this should be pretty seamless. All right, I think that's good enough. Maybe we'll come in here and do this as well. Cool. I'm just studying the picture for a minute and trying to reassess what else there is for me to do to this. I think overall, I think I can go deeper. And when I say overall, this blend here, I think we can make everything, including the horse and all that stuff. So I'm going to come to the top, and with our colorful layer, we're going to make right underneath here a final contrast layer. And I often play with this stuff at the end. And I feel feels like more nighttime to me, and it's kind of what we want this to be. It's the dawn of the day and coming out of this emotional distress for me. So I think that's starting to feel really darn good. Feels a little pink still, so maybe I'll come up to the color here again. We added a tiny bit of green, maybe this time add a little bit cyan. Make it a little bit more moody maybe. So now I'm getting sort of borderline for what I think the picture should be when it comes to the darkness. We can come in here and give some highlights, which I think will benefit it. This is getting a lot of attention, which I want to tone down. And we're going to do some of these local movements to try to, now that it's so dark and borderline dark of what we want it to be, maybe bring some highlights back up so it doesn't feel quite so dense, even though it feels more like night. So let's take a look at that. We're going to make two layers. We're going to make one that we push up, and this will be similar to a little bit what one do when one do beauty retouching for face. We're going to call this for a highlight. We're going to call this highlight. I call this highlight sometimes, other times I call them, local contrast, but it's kind of the same thing. Create another one, and we're going to pull this one down. We're going to call this darker. So, and again, select the mask and fill it with black so it doesn't affect anything for now. So then we're going to come in with a big brush with our erase tool and tone this down. This area here definitely don't need to be as bright. And then for these other areas, especially right here in the river, I'm going to use the eraser again. I feel this definitely need to be highlighted a bit. And I'm not sure if I have enough here, so let's see. We're going to come into our highlight. I'm going to push this higher. That's pretty nice. Some of these then got too much, so we got to come back into the highlight layer, and we're going to tone down what happened on the rocks here a little bit. But I definitely like this. I definitely like this grass here. Maybe we could even pull some detail into this, give it some shape. Maybe in these greens here, and some nice texture. Right there. Maybe even right in here. Felt a little bit much, but nice. So let's look at that, what it did. It definitely creates some pools and pockets of light and texture that we can look at. I'm going to do one more run. Maybe we'll just add a little bit of interest. Do this at an opacity here. So I did it first 100%. I undid that with Command C, and then I'm gonna just paint in a little bit along here. This is our destination, so maybe there should be some detail in here. I still want to see more. Let me see. I'm gonna highlight this river here too. I want to see more of this river, so I think we want to create a separate highlight for that. I'm going to push that quite far. Or let's see, before I do this, before I double do something, as in making one place darker and another lighter, I'm going to come into this darkness here, my contrast layer. And I'm just going to mask out this area. So what I was about to do there was to create another layer to make this brighter, but instead of making this brighter, I'm just going to mask out the layer that made it brighter, made it darker in the first place. So I'm going to continue doing that actually, bring some highlight to this. And I'm starting to feel pretty darn good. Pretty darn good. So we added this density layer here, again to tone down this area, which I didn't find so interesting. And I'm going to do a little bit more. I went a little bit wide here on this density. So there. Okay, so I'm just fine-tuning these a little bit, turning them on and off to see what I see what I like. Early on, white dots in landscape. I'm going to take out more of these. And just feel too bright. So I removed one, looked at some of these others and figured it might just be easier to come in on the mask that I already have that's making these darker. Just going to paint in. Yeah, I think that's better. I'm starting to feel really good about this. Truly, truly, truly. The moon still don't quite do it. Still don't quite do it. Let me see. I wonder if it's too strong. The sky is really soft and wispy. Maybe there's too much contrast, or maybe it's too sharp. So maybe I'll give it a little bit of opacity and see what that will do to it. Come to the moon. It's already at 61%, so I think that feels a little bit better. And still, it has a little bit of greenness to it. When it come into our, it says curves here, but this should be color. See if we could take away some of that green. We'll start with, oh, it's a little too red. Let's split the difference. I said take away green, but as I looked at it, I changed my mind and thought maybe we should do the opposite of cyan instead. So there. I just need to make it brighter too. Take up this anchor point so it becomes a little flatter and a little brighter. And let me see. Maybe it's just a matter of doing some of this so the edges of it don't come so sharp as if there's clouds in front of it that's drifting by. That feels a little bit better. So let me come into these sky options here, and we're going to fine-tune these masks. We're going to use the same process as we did. We already sort of selected it fairly well. It's simple cutout, so we're going to come in, select our selection. That's not what we wanted to do. And then click there, and there. Now we have our selection. We're going to feather this by 1. Command Shift invert it. We're going to hide it, and then we're going to come to our layer on the outside with a brush and start painting this away. Oh, opposite. I'm sorry. We're going to come back. We're going to actually erase because we want to take this away. So we need to come back to our feather, and then we can start erasing. So what I told you to do there was by habit saying we invert it, and we then use the brush. In this case, our selection was for the bottom and not for the actual sky, so it was just to select it and start erasing rather than doing it the other way around. So I'm going to come to 0% here. It will probably be a little bit more effective. I'm just going to walk along this edge, and as you see, we'll take away that blue residue by using this technique. Looking at this now, this edge feels a little bit sharper on our cowboy. And then there's some white spots here as well. So I'm going to come into that in a minute and soften those edges. Okay. I'm going to try not to make it car sick here when it's moving so fast, but we've got to come back to where we started and go to the left of that selection area. Here we have an area of the selection that it's been going into, so put that in there. All right, not bad. So now that we've done it on one layer, we can do this up here as well. So we just click on this selection, we come up to our sky, the second one. I'm going to take a look at this one here. And it's a complete personal preference, right? Which one would like to go with. Obviously now it feels a little bit too bright and we need to darken it. So I'm going to come in and do this as well, so you could see some different options here. First of all, we're going to hide this, and then I'm going to do the same. We come through here and we brush in some of these areas. Now that I went through this with a brush, I think we could just, I was about to say we can just do Command Delete and fill it all, and I think that's going to work out fine. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't become as crisp though, so let me just go through. I did fill it one time, but still a few places here. Cool. I like the top stuff that goes on here. We're going to do the same as we did with the other sky. And I'm going to come into this gradation tool this time. See if I can just do this. (23% quite doesn't do it, so I'm going to come in again and do it 100%. See if we can brighten this bottom end. So basically I'm creating a mask here. I'll do that again. Too much. Basically I'm creating a mask with the gradient at the bottom so that we highlight the bottom, take away the contrast essentially just at the end. I can help it a little bit with a brush in these areas where it goes darker, just by painting in a little bit. And again, this sky feels a little pink, so we're going to come up here, just add a little bit of green to it. Oh, way too much. There maybe. I don't know. What do you guys think? When I put together this initially and tried this guy, I felt it looked better for the landscape, but I felt it took away from the guy when I put it in. And I still feel quite the same way about this guy, so we're going to take that out and let it be a subtler sky with a little highlight, and then make it more about the guy and the horse. So I think that's pretty much it. I think there's a few things here that I haven't paid quite attention to. Remember, we moved the guy. I have not been in here to fine-tune these masks after, so let's take a look at that so that we know we have something that truly works. I made the guy smaller and pushed him back a little bit, so these edges here are not quite right. So we're going to close out our sky layers, the river layer. The river layer felt pretty good at the end, so I'm not sure if you have to revisit that, but we definitely need to take a look at our cowboy. Take it all the way down here, and then just see where our edges go. And obviously not perfect when it comes to the residue and the way this sits. So I think I took this too far down, so we're just gonna do it the opposite way. Just find a way to just find an edge essentially that will let us cut through this. And again, I think the option here would be to put the plant behind something, and I think we have our edge right here to make this happen. So I'm going to use this and come down in here. It's a nice edge where we could come along and introduce the grass. I'll hide this real quick. Yeah, feels pretty good. I'm going to deselect that, maybe come across that edge and just use the brush to put it behind this. I already have a shadow layer in here somewhere, so I'm going to find that shadow layer and place it so that it sits right along this edge. Now I'm just creating my own ledge here by using a smaller brush and trying to find a way that this will feel believable. So again, I'm using these brushes at different opacities and just blending the rock that the cowboy stood on and the rock that's underneath. So now obviously I've done a lot of funky stuff here on the edges, and I'm going to come in here and try to clean this up a tiny bit. Sorry for going quiet here, but I'm following the same process. Just trying to find some edges that will feel good to cut along and blend along. So that feels a lot better. What's quite great with these shapes is that, you know, they're just taken a few 100 feet apart, not even 100 feet, maybe 100 feet even. So they all have the same textures and they all just blend into each other. So it's just a matter of finding the right shapes that will, just right here you have this cool shapes here. So if we just blend the textures up to these ridges, they will feel just like they belong there. Again, this is obviously not great work here, so we got to come in and clean this up. But as long as it looks good and we're aware of these edges, so as long as there's no unwanted residue that we can't control, take a look at this. Yeah, there's some great edges here, and it doesn't feel like it's completely out of control at all. Just feels like nice blends between different rocks. One of the last things we got to do is to get rid of that road down here, and that's a simple, we're going to just take some of these pieces here and just clone them in. So we're going to come back to the bottom here. All the clone layers we do has to be within the set underneath the contrast changes that we do. So this is the one we're going to take the most from. Now that I see this, there's a tiny bit of discrepancy. I'm going to just try to fix that right in here. Again, the process is the same. We're selecting our brush and eraser tool and just come in and create my own edge here in the transition between the two pieces. Yeah, it feels a little sloppy when you look at the red mask, but when you look in there, it's so dark. It's going to take a lot for the eye to go there and think that's not organic or doesn't belong there. So now that we clean that transition up, we're going to look at the road down there, and then we're going to call this picture for finished. So we'll just select another layer, and then we do our clone tool. We'll do current and below, and then I'm just gonna, maybe that's too zoomed in, just set my marker up in here somewhere and then start painting this in as if they perfectly belong together. So I'm doing a smaller brush as I get into this edge here. And that got too much right in there, so I'm choosing my eraser. And by cloning on a separate layer, it's really easy to undo or go back. Create some harder edge right there. And then we just continue. Maybe we'll pick a slightly different place this time, maybe up in, it can't be too far away because then the focus is going to get a little funky, but maybe we'll pick one right up in here this time. Increase our brush a bit, and then we just keep on doing it. Now that this is linked to this layer below it, it won't let me clone further into this area because this area here belonged to the left layer. So we're going to do this again, come underneath the right side and clone again. And the reason for me doing this is that if I were to clone above this area here, and I for any reason were to change my blend layer, the layer that really subtly connects these two pieces, I would need to redo the cloning if I were to change this. Anything you clone above a correction layer will be a part of the cloning, and if you change the correction layer, your cloning will be way off. So it's important to know that you only clone straight above content layers and not above correction layers. So we're going to do the same process, and do a smaller one again. It's a little bit of back and forth right in here, which layer that affects it and not. So let's go a little back and forth, and we will finish this up in style. Not 100% on the moon still. I'm going to try to make it a little brighter because the sky is so bright, maybe the moon should be brighter as well. So we're going to come up here, turn the cowboy layer down, and to our contrast, Huh. I'm not sure what I like better. I think what I need to do is to give it some more shape. So now there's a good shape because of the mask I gave, that there's a shadow up here and there's light here, and the moon is so uniform. So maybe the trick here would be to come into a contrast layer and give the moon some shape. Yeah, I think that works better. Now, as we paint it onto our mask, I can come in and maybe push that back a bit. So add an opacity, I use my eraser, and pull it back a tiny bit like that. And I think that's it. I think we've been through this picture quite beautifully, and I'm really happy with this first image in the Open Vista series. We're going to do the same for the warmer tones. Not going to be as exact masking it out. I'm going to make that go a little bit quicker, but I do want you to see the different color palettes you can create with shooting through different times of the day. Even though these are just maybe half an hour to an hour apart, it's still two fairly different tones and fairly different feelings to the same, essentially same photograph. So I'm going to hit my Command Save button and let this file save, and say thank you for following me along for this retouch. And I'll see you in a few minutes as we go into the warmer tone retouch, a little bit quicker, blending the elements, but not as thoroughly as on this one. And we can see what the color will do to a warmer tone for the same photograph. See you soon.